let people keep coming for a second, or do you want to do the
Yeah,
intros? Okay, so
yeah. Welcome everybody. I know people are still entering. As people come in, we will go ahead and mute everyone and turn off your video just for quality of recording and everything. Um, and kind of get started. So tonight we have our virtual pubs and profs with Dr. Eric Schuck of the Linfield Economics Department. And he is going to talk to us all about global containership industry. I know nothing about it. Some of you may know something about it. We're lifelong learners, so it's going to be fun. So yeah, make sure you have a drink, whether that's water or a nice beer, and hang out. And thank you all so much for coming. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or just say hey. And I will throw it over to you.
okay, thanks. Good evening, all. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. I know it's a Thursday night, and it's I don't know what the weather's like where everybody is. It is a beautiful night in McMinnville, so it's definitely the fact that you made the choice to be here, looking at a screen when it's an absolutely lovely Thursday night in McMinnville. I thank you so much. It is pubs and profs, so I've got my beers. So if you give me one sec here. So what I got here is, this is a Saison, farmhouse Saison from Foreland Brewing here in McMinnville. For those of you who are familiar with the breweries in McMinnville, this is they just took over the old Allegory space. And this is in my lovely YCAP Meltdown pint glass. So, if you don't know about the Meltdown is a fundraiser for, it's a fundraiser for YCAP, the local food bank and assistance program here in town. And so I'm just trying to do my best to represent McMinnville there. And if you have, this is meant to be informal. It's meant to be a conversation more than anything else. I've got some slides to run through just so that I'm organized. But if you have questions, just drop them in the chat. I'll try to answer those as I go. And don't stand on ceremony. I will tell you this is the first time I've given this presentation, so it's always going to be as much of a mystery to you as it is to me. So with that, what I'll do is I'll go into share screen and we will try to get this going. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, let's make sure I get this so I know what I'm talking about. So we're just talking about basically sort of a 30,000 foot view of the container ship industry and talk about sort of, what are the basics, what's going on in the industry. You will notice that the front cover here, this is SS Linfield Victory. SS Linfield Victory was a cargo ship that was built very late in World War II. She was a Victory ship built up in Portland. She was not a container ship. She was what we call a break bulk cargo hold ship. So she basically just had big hatches, and you'd open them up and you drop things inside and close the door. That is not what a container ship's like, but I had to throw Linfield Victory in there because she's kind of amazing. So the other part I got to say is I'm Eric Schuck. Y'all know that part. And I am the Dean Dave Hansen Chair in Economics. So this is brought to you by way of that as well. So the way this is going to go is we're going to kind of talk just a little bit about shipping containers in general. Believe it or not, they're a really big deal. They're celebrating their 65th birthday this year, which is kind of cool. We'll talk about the relationship between the shipping container and economies of scale and sort of the signs of economies of scale within the global container ship industry. We'll talk about the nature of the global container ship industry, that the shipping lines are very much an oligopoly, and there's some things that go with it being an oligopoly. Or if, for those of you who knew, if any of you out there had Dave Hansen as your econ professor for principles, you will know that he always called it oligopoly. So I feel obligated to say oligopoly. Then we'll talk about sort of how COVID has affected the global container ship industry. And then last but not least, just because it is Earth Day, and I feel a certain obligation to talk about that, we'll talk about sort of the challenge of climate change as it relates to global shipping, because maritime shipping actually has a really interesting place when it comes to climate change. It's very unique, and people don't always realize it. So we'll talk about that. So that's kind of where we're headed. Now, probably everybody, we're all, in rapt attention when we saw the MV Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal, right? We all saw that. We all saw, this giant ship get stuck in the Suez Canal and basically bring half the world, not half the world, 13% of the world's trade, 13% of the world's trade to a screeching halt. Okay. And I don't know, a lot of people are like, huh, I've never really thought, well, I think about it all the time, but that's just me. But a lot of other people probably around thinking, wow, I did not realize that one ship getting stuck in one place could bring 13% of the world's trade to a screeching halt for a week. And that's a very unique thing. That's something that we probably would not have seen that happen even 10 or 15 years ago. It's something which is very much a byproduct of the evolution of container ships over the last 20, almost 30 years, to wind up in a situation where you can literally have one ship that is in fact capable of clogging one of the world's major trade arteries. And it's an interesting situation. It's when you talk about Ever Given, she's going from Malaysia en route to the Netherlands. So she's going from a container port just outside of kind of near Singapore to Rotterdam. And she gets stuck in Egypt. The ship itself is owned by a Japanese holding company. She's operated by a Taiwanese shipping firm. Her crew was Indian, and the flag is Panamanian. So this is a very, very, international vessel in so many ways. And that kind of in a microcosm is the world of international shipping. Okay. You've got this one ship sort of embodies all these things that are really important in sort of the way that global maritime shipping has evolved. And it's kind of, well, how did we get here? How did we wind up in this situation that we've got something where this one gigantic ship can bring everything to a screeching halt? And why is it that we have one gigantic ship? Why is it we have one, why is it you have the one gigantic ship that is owned by a company in one country, run by a company in another country, crewed by people from over here, and the flag, the actual ship that it's titled in, that the country it's titled in, is over here, and none of them are connected? How does that happen? And it's very much a byproduct of globalization. It's very much a sort of something that we see as a result of sort of this global network of supply chains. And it's a really critical piece of it. When you talk about, all of the goods that we consume, globally, about 90% of all goods will eventually be transported by sea at some point in their product cycle. So 90% of everything is going to wind up transported by sea at some point within its production cycle. And that's a pretty amazing number if you think about it. And the reason it gets transported by sea is for a very obvious reason. It's cheaper. It's significantly cheaper. And it's so much cheaper. It's like orders of magnitude cheaper that's why it happens. And when you look at the worldwide transportation system, it's very much built around these very, very large container ships. Globally, there's about 56,000 merchant vessels out there that are registered. So 56,000 are registered. So it's like 56,000 that are actually have, licenses. There's probably more than that. We've all got that neighbor who's got the Camaro in the backyard that we, don't talk about. So maybe more than 56,000, at least 56,000. Of those 56,000, about 10% of them are container ships, and they're the workhorse of global trade. They're the workhorse, and nobody really thinks about it. But it's something that when you start talking about them, let's see if I can get this. This is the moment of truth. Can I get this to work? Hopefully. Can you guys see a map with a bunch of dots? You don't see that. Okay, so let me drop out of this for a sec here. Let's see if I can get this to stop sharing that for a moment, and we'll start sharing something else. Okay, now do you hopefully see, do we see a map with a whole bunch of dots on it? Okay, sweet. Okay, so this is marinetraffic.com, which is it's a commercial firm that tracks AIS, automatic identification signals. Ships are supposed to have transponders that let you know where they are. This is literally every ship on the planet that is currently emitting a signal from its AIS tracker. People have a tendency to think that the ocean is empty, that there's nothing out there, and this is literally all the ships that are out there right now. And what you see is all of the, let's see, the red ones, the red little ships, those are tankers. The green ones are all your cargo vessels. And then the kind of orangey ones are fishing. And then the naval vessels have a different color, but I'm not seeing any right now. The Navy ships tend not to, they may or may not put their transponders on what they're doing. But the ocean is anything but empty. And there's these great maritime highways that go everywhere. And you can kind of see sort of how they move. You can see sort of how things flow, that you got these ships moving across the Pacific, basically from China across over to the major ports on the West Coast. You got this other stream that goes from China down here through the Straits of Malacca, and it either goes up through the Suez Canal, then across the Mediterranean, or it goes down around the Cape of Good Hope and up around that way. But it's these great maritime highways that we don't really realize they're there, but they're really, really critical. I personally, I just look at this. I like pop this up in the morning when I get to work because I find it very soothing. That's what I think is exciting. But it's just kind of, it really brings it into scale, just how much is actually going on out there and how the sheer volume of traffic that's out there. So it's kind of cool. And like I said, it's something that happens in the background and people don't necessarily realize it's really occurring. So that's what we're gonna be talking through here, is sort of that. Come on. All right, we got this. Trying to migrate now. How this happened is, first of all, this degree of globalization, this degree, this sheer volume of maritime trade, it really is very much a new modern phenomenon. It's something that's really only taken place within the last 65 years in particular, but especially within the last 30. Up until World War II, most of your shipping, international shipping, was what we call nationally flagged, meaning that it was ships where it was ships that were owned by firms within a country transporting goods back and forth between ports that were belong to that country. So you have like American ships sending stuff to and from American ports, or you'd have British ships sending stuff back and forth between the British Empire. That was a little unusual. Also, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. So it's kind of cool to see that map. There was one exception, and that was because of something called the Lafayette Siemens Act. In the teens, about 1916, the United States passed a law to improve the conditions of sailors working on merchant vessels, to prevent, for those of us who are Oregonians or Oregonian adjacent, we all know the lovely history of Shanghai, otherwise known as crimping, where you would get people who didn't want to be sailors, you get them drunk and get them jobs on merchant ships that they didn't necessarily want. And then they would discover this when they're out at sea and they're kind of stuck. Okay. To prevent that from happening, the US government passed a series of laws to basically govern the rules under which merchant sailors could work. Lafayette Siemens Act. It really increased the costs of merchant shipping. So what a lot of American ships did was, to avoid the regulation of the Lafayette Siemens Act, they started flagging their vessels in Panama. So they started, that really was the advent of using what we call flags of convenience, of this migration away from your actual home country and trying to flag your ship in the most permissive regulatory environment. That was sort of an exception, but other than that, every other country, basically, it's like if it was their ship, they had their flag on it. World War II sort of upended all that, changed all that completely. For a variety of reasons, before the US entered the war, the US found it convenient to flag our ships in Panama and then to a lesser extent in Liberia, in part because it made it easier to send cargo into war zones. So one of the ways we provided Lend-Lease to Great Britain was actually to send it in other country ships, even though they're American. But the other thing about World War II, and we know this very well here in Oregon, is that we built a lot of ships. And one of the side effects is that at the end of World War II, you have this massive number of cargo ships that are built that suddenly wind up on the civilian market. The government had built them to run cargo. At the end of the war, they sell them. They're all brand new. They're all basically identical, and they all have similar characteristics. And when that happened, you wind up getting a global commercial fleet that's not quite uniform. It's pretty close to uniform though, made up basically of Liberty and Victory ships, surplus Liberty and Victory ships. And they're out there. It means that everything's the same age, it's the same characteristics. It just made the market super competitive. And if you think about it, if every single person who's in a particular industry is using the exact same equipment, the only way to really differentiate yourself from your competitors is to try to get cheaper, try to find ways to make yourself, that much more attractive to the people using your services. So one of the side effects of this, massive volume of ships hitting the commercial market after World War II is that people get super competitive. They start trying to find different ways to make themselves cheaper, to make themselves, more cost advantageous. So you see the acceleration of the use of flags of convenience, particularly Panama and Liberia, because then you don't have to comply with the working rules in, say, the United States or the United Kingdom. Apparently I can't spell Liberia. You see some others used as well. The process of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s also saw a bunch of other countries start using that flag use. So you start seeing that there's this disconnect between shipping companies and the countries where they operate from. Okay. The other thing that you start seeing too is they start trying to find different ways to add revenue. And the way that you add revenue in shipping is you add cargo. Okay. So you got to find some other way. How can I get more stuff on my ship? And that led to this interest, what we call multimodal shipping. That is, you want to make it so that you can get, ships don't make money sitting in port. Okay, that is not where they make money. They make their money moving stuff back and forth, and you want to spend as little time in port as possible. You want to get the stuff on and get it moving. So they wanted to accelerate that process, and they wanted to do it in ways that allowed them to carry more cargo. And the way you do that's what we call multimodal. You make it easier to get the stuff off the ship into its follow-on transportation system. So you want to get it off the ship onto trucks, off the ship onto trains, however it's going away from you. There had been some experiments with containers going back to World War I, but nobody really standardized it. During Korea, during the Korean War, the US military started experimenting with something called the Container Express system. Anybody ever heard of a Connex box? Any military out there ever heard of a Connex box? If you're military, you know what a Connex box is. You've seen like 1,000 of them. Connex boxes are, like, oh, Connex box is a shipping container. Well, yeah, there's a reason it's shipping containers, because the military developed them during Korea to facilitate the cargo shipping. Civilian processors saw these ideas and thought, you know what, we can make these better. And they started getting this kind of back and forth process of taking the military idea of these continental container express systems. How do they make it better? How do they facilitate it? And by 1956, you get the creation of what we would today recognize as a shipping container. And the original thing they put them on was they put them on these old World War II surplus tankers, because they could stack them on the deck of the tankers, and then it added the extra cargo that they could make money off of. So it's like, okay, I'm a tanker, I'm making money off the fuel that I'm carrying in the main cargo, but if I've got these containers stacked across the deck, then I can make that much more money, so that then each trip I make, I'm generating more revenue than my competitors. Now, those original World War II tankers are converted. They weren't perfect. They were not very big. They had this problem that there was no equipment to get them to get the it was a ship that got stuck in an anomaly in the beginning of new normal. I hope it's not. I hope it's an anomaly. I really hope it's an anomaly. We'll talk about that in a minute. But these conversions, there's no infrastructure in the ports to handle the containers, so they had to lift them off with the cranes that were actually on the ships. So it was a neat idea. Everybody loved it, but it's like, okay, there's a limit on this. We don't have it. You still have to take it off of the ship's cranes. The ports themselves weren't designed to handle them. So it's an innovation. Everybody thinks it's awesome. They're getting some mileage out of them on these converted tankers, but it really wasn't taken off. Then you get Vietnam. And the US military starts using shipping containers like nobody's business. And they take the Korean War era Connex boxes, they add in some of the innovations that have come through the civilian side in the mid 50s and start using them left and right. And at the height of the Vietnam War, the US military is using about 200,000 containers. Now, if you've got one customer using 200,000 of something, do you think that people are going to react to that market? Especially if it's a customer that pays a lot of money. You know, we all know, Department of Defense is not known for being cheap. So it really, really accelerated the process. It also had the advantage that everybody's like, okay, you know what? If I build everything to a standard that Department of Defense is going to use it, I know I got a guaranteed customer. So that process really accelerated the 1960s of people trying to meet that Vietnam demand. So it started becoming much more common then. And it really did start transforming global shipping in the 1960s. Like I said, it was still kind of limited because you still had to use the ship's cranes to manage it, but people start recognizing, oh, we need to get purpose-built ships. We got to, we need to start doing something that it can actually take advantage of this technology. And by the 1960s, these conversions of World War II vessels, they were starting at the end of their service lives. So they're replacing them with purpose-built vessels. They start saying, we're going to make something that specifically can take advantage of this. You also get that the oil crisis accelerated that process because suddenly it's like, okay, in 1973, oil gets really expensive. You don't want expensive ships operating. We want to come up with stuff that's as cheap as possible. And it really also accelerated the process. So it really just separates the wheat from the chaff pretty darn fast. The other thing it did was you start seeing that a lot of your traditional ports get left behind because the technology itself favors very specific types of infrastructure. The technology favors having bigger ships because more containers. You have specialized capital in the cranes. You've already, I realize people probably don't hang out in ports. If you've seen the cranes, the large, they're very specific and they're kind of expensive. But you also need a lot of real estate for them. You have to have a lot of space for that. You also have to have very easy access to rails and highways. So what you start seeing is that traditional ports in urban areas, if you've been in San Francisco, been down along the Embarcadero, that's the traditional port district in San Francisco. There's no train connection there. There's no easy access to an interstate. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bay, over in Oakland or over toward Alameda, you do have those things. You start seeing this replacement of traditional urban ports like San Francisco with Oakland and Alameda because they have easy access to other connection hubs. You get the movement of shipping from downtown New York. If it was in New York, like the Chelsea Pier area, that gets replaced with Camden, New Jersey. Felixstowe in London replaces, in England replaces London. You get Rotterdam replacing Antwerp because Rotterdam has an easier approach to the sea compared to Antwerp. Antwerp, you have to go down the Scheldt estuary. It's really hard to navigate. So but you see this major realignment geographically of where the ships are going in to places that are big enough to handle the containers, have the specialized cranes, and have easy access to rail hubs and interstate hubs. On the West Coast, what we see is Seattle is one of the few traditional ports that actually still took advantage of it. But you do see a shift. For those of you who are familiar with Seattle, you know that it moved from closer to the market. It moved down south over closer to where the stadiums are. So you see that in LA, you see things start happening in around Long Beach, but it's very, very, this major realignment. That was going on through the 70s and 80s. And that whole process just goes on steroids when China starts entering global markets in the 1980s. And when China is granted most favored nation status by the WTO under the Clinton administration, in the late Clinton administration, it just accelerates even further, that you start getting China becoming sort of the factory to the world. What happens then is this. You see this massive change in what container ships are like. So your early container ships, that the converted C2, C3 tankers, they're about maybe 137 meters long. So, maybe 450-ish feet long. They can hold maybe about, 4 containers tall, 6 across. You're talking about grand total, maybe about 500 to 800 TEU. A TEU is a 20-foot equivalent unit. It's your standard shipping container. It's 8 by 8 by 20. And that's sort of, when we talk in shipping, we talk about 2 basic sizes, TEUs and FEUs. A TEU is a 20-foot unit, FEU is a 40-foot unit. But you can take maybe 500 to 800. And those really are sort of workhorse through the 50s, 60s, into the early 70s. 70s, you start seeing some of these dedicated container ships. They're purpose built. They're still in the 1,000 to 2,500 container range. They sort of are the standard to the 70s. Then you start seeing in the 80s, gets a little bigger. You start getting what's called a Panamax. Panamax means it's the maximum size that'll fit through the Panama Canal, hence Panamax. You'll notice their dimensions are very specific. They are exactly 30, their beam is 32 meters. That will allow you to fit through the Panama Canal with about that much space. And it is literally about that much space. It's pretty tight. But those, yet again, you're talking about maybe 3,000, 3,400. And that's really where we sort of stay, is maybe in that 3,000 to upper bound, about 5,000, 6,000 container range from the 80s through until about 2000. Then in 2000, you start seeing these much larger vessels that can hold a lot more. So you start going from that 3,000 to 6,000 range up to the 8,000 range. With your post-Panamax categories, those are about 8,000. Then 2014, you start seeing what at the time were referred to as mega ships of 12,000 containers. Then you get, beginning a little around 2006, what we call VLCS, very large container ships. VLCS, very large container ship. ULCS, ultra large container ship. It's very classy. And then the mega ships. I always feel like you gotta do that in the mega ships of 20,000 containers or more beginning around 2018, 2019. Ever Given, the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, is only 3 years old. She was built in 2018. She is not an old ship. So you got to ask yourself, like, what's going on with it? Why are we seeing that we go, from 500, that makes sense, it's conversion. Then 2000 or so, those work about 20 years. Then you start seeing kind of low thousands. And then within the last really, less than 10 years, we start going from 12,000 to 20,000 to now we're like 20,000. What's going on with that? Why are they suddenly like so gigantic? What's going on with that is, anybody want to take a guess? Anyone take a guess why suddenly we went from, within the span of like 10 years, they start getting like 5 times as big? Any good guesses? Tim, I know you're out there. Okay. Money, exactly. It's a heck of a lot cheaper. It is so much cheaper to operate those mega ships compared to the smaller ones. And what we see is, when you come on, you want to turn, that process of them getting bigger, they're getting bigger and they're getting bigger at an accelerating rate. Okay. And it's purely because of cost. It's as an expression of economies of scale. When we talk about the International Transportation Forum, which is an operation, it's part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an organization that covers your major developed economies. The maximum size of ships is getting bigger at a faster rate. It's like 77, the biggest ship in service in 77 was 3,126 TEUs. 1990, 13 years later, it's about, 4,800. So not quite, maybe that's, what is that? So 3,000, so that's about 60% bigger. Less than 10 years after that, it's almost 80% bigger. Then 10 years after that, it's almost twice as big. And then you start getting another, another 25%, 30% bigger than that. But between 97 and 2017, in those 20-year period, the biggest ships get about 2.5 times bigger. Okay. It gets a lot bigger really fast. They seem to be topping out at about 25,000 right now. That seems to be, there's about 50 that are under construction right now. Yeah, okay. So the 5600 condition of those 20K small type vessel, the smaller 5600 and smaller are still kind of the workhorses. When you talk about the average size out there, the average one out in the fleet of all the fleets is still probably around 5,000 TEU. So, you know, about 50-60% of the ships that are out there are in that 5,000, 6,000 range. The new construction, it's only about 1,200 TEU. There's not as many of them out there. They're primarily for regional trade. So what you see is the side effect of all this is that your new construction out there is getting way big, way fast, but it's very bimodal. It's really split between, you've got probably about 20% of the new construction is in these gigantic ships. And then another 20% is kind of in about this 2,500 range. And what you're catching is you've got the mega ships are being used to go between major ports, so like Shanghai to Long Beach. And then you've got the smaller ships that are working the kind of feeder routes off of that. So I think it's kind of a hub and spoke thing going with that. So we're seeing significant evidence of major economies of scale, and that the costs bear it out. When you look at the cost per TEU, the cost per container, it's about $1,600 per container for a 2,500 TEU vessel. It's about $400 per container for a 20,000 TEU vessel. Okay, so there's a major cost advantage to having these mega ships. It's way cheaper. And like I said, what's happening there is that it's accelerating the construction of these mega ships because they're so much cheaper. It doesn't make any sense to have the smaller ones. We actually are seeing a major scrapping effort at the same time, that you're seeing a lot of these kind of mid-range ships that are just going to the breakers because they are not cost competitive. And the smaller ones are hanging around largely as sort of feeders in between the major ports. So it's really getting really bimodal. It's kind of, two extremes. It's, mega ships of 20,000 containers or smaller stuff to service the smaller routes. Believe it or not, Portland counts as a smaller route. Portland is a smaller route. So major economies of scale going on with that. When you have those levels of economies of scale, it also tends to show up in industrial organization. And what we see is that most of the major shipping lines, the global shipping lines, are an oligopoly. When you look back in 2000, we talk about CRs, concentration ratios. Concentration ratios are the fraction of market share that are accounted for by the major firms. So when you look at the CR10, the concentration ratio, the fraction of market that's held by the top 10 biggest firms, in 2000, they had about 12% market share. In 2019, the 10 largest shipping lines had 85% market share. It's pretty interesting. They're not. It's really kind of the top seven. The top seven. When you talk about the single biggest shipping company out there, Maersk out of Denmark. Maersk accounts for about 15-18% of total global market share. They have an alliance with another European shipping company. I just blanked on which one it is, but between the two of them, they account for about 28% of all global trade of those two with their cooperation. When you have oligopolies, or to go with Dave Hansen, oligopolies, they're really volatile. They're really volatile. If you guys remember from basic econ, we talk about oligopolies, they're always trying to muscle for market share. They never want to give ground on things. Mega ships need to be full both ways. Yes, they're not profitable unless they're at about an 85% or more capacity. They do have a problem right now, and we'll get to this in a minute, is that they tend to operate full with cargo coming from China to the US, but they tend to be currently running a lot of empty containers back to China. There's a lot going on with that. Are they seaworthy? They're not, I mean, you have to ballast them. You have to ballast them to keep them, yeah. Yes, correct. That is correct. When the new section of the Panama Canal is built to accommodate the larger container ships, but the mega ones are bigger than that. They cannot fit through. There are some, the new vision, the new version Panamaxes, there is a specific type that's between 16 and 20,000 TEUs that can fit through the revised Panama Canal, but the 24,000 ones, you talk about Ben Franklin, the GCM carrier, she won't fit. She would get stuck. So you do not want to, you don't want a bottle stopper in the Panama Canal. That's bad. But oligopolies are all about market share. They want to make sure that they maintain their position. So it's really volatile. They're very, very competitive on price. And what you see with that is that a container is a container is a container. So that the product really isn't differentiated. So they can only compete on price. So it means that the prices go up and down like nobody's business. And according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the freight rates from the China to the West Coast, which is the one we obviously tend to pay the most attention to, has bounced around between about $1,279 for a 40-foot equivalent unit in 2016 to a high of $2,308 for a 40-foot equivalent unit in 2010. It's currently running closer to about 3,000 right now. That's a byproduct of COVID. We'll get to that in a minute. But it bounces around all over the place. It's a really volatile market. When you have markets that are that volatile, you tend to get major boom bust cycles. You get things where they're either making a lot of money or they're making no money. We have seen that quite commonly with us. For those of you who are familiar with Portland, Portland's main container terminal, Terminal 6, the Port of Portland, went through about 4 years where we didn't have container service because it was simply not profitable to work out of the Port of Portland. Oh, okay. Tariffs and so, the shipping patterns, we didn't get the steel and aluminum stuff. Most of our, this is a slightly different topic, steel and aluminum, the bulk of American steel and aluminum, actually, a lot of it comes from Canada. So the country that was probably harmed the most, though some of it was Korea and Japan, but a lot of it comes over the road or over rail from Canada. So there was an impact from the steel and aluminum, but it's less pronounced because of the volume of shipping that comes from Canada. Doesn't mean we shouldn't get rid of the tariffs. That's editorial commentary on my part. But so Portland's Terminal 6 went 4 years without having a container company serving the port because it just wasn't profitable for them. In 2019, we did get SM, which is a smaller regional carrier from Korea, coming back on that one. But you had multiple bankruptcies in 2016. Of those top 10 that we see, at various points in the last 10 years, at least 3 of them have been going bankrupt. So it's very, very volatile, very boom and bust. And what they've done is they've tried to create alliances across the top 10 firms to restrict overcapacity. They try to coordinate their activities to make sure that they're not competing against each other. Now, strictly speaking, in the United States, that would be illegal. That would violate American antitrust law, but because you're talking about international trade, it doesn't necessarily violate antitrust law. Having said that, the Federal Maritime Commission is currently investigating that. So they're looking to see if there is in fact a violation of US law on that one. I think it's serious profitability challenges, huge profitability challenges. So you want to think about this as you've got an industry where the tendency is to get bigger and bigger and bigger because that's the cheapest thing out there. But even as you do that, nobody's making any money. Okay, not a fun place to be. So you get that. And then just for fun, let's toss in COVID. So last year, when COVID hit, the Baltos Baltos Freightos, well, Baltos or Freightos container index is sort of a standard global index of container cost. It basically is the average container cost across your 12 major shipping lanes, shipping patterns across the world. You notice that before COVID, everything's down kind of about, you know, $1,500 or so per container. And it's kind of rising up a little bit January 20, gets up around $600, and then it comes down again in the early stages of the pandemic. But you know, they're kind of limping along. They get a slight uptick late in January, then things come down again, kind of doldrums a bit. And then basically last fall, it starts going through the roof, through the absolute roof. And the average now across these 12 major shipping lanes is about $4,200 per container for a 40-foot equivalent unit. That's a lot. So you've got a whole bunch of firms that basically went from making no money, always on the verge of bankruptcy, to now they're just getting money hand over fist. And they've actually gotten to a point now where they have sort of a opposite problem. When you talk about where they were when COVID struck, they had low prices, they had excess capacity, no one's making any money. In the early stages of COVID, people had ships that were just stuck. The crews were also stuck. That's a whole other thing. The crews, the crews typically are not employees of the shipping company. They're hired by ship agents to work on the ship. They've got term contracts. So when their contracts are up, they're supposed to get off the ship. But to do that, they have to be able to pull into port. And during the height of last spring's issues with COVID, nobody wanted ships to pull in. So these poor sailors got stuck on their ships. Some of these guys have been, there's some are still there. You got guys who've been on their ships now for 13, 18 months. It gets interesting because then it's not really clear who owes them overtime. Because they're not necessarily employees of the shipping company whose ship they're working. They're contracts of the ship agent that hired them. And then the labor laws that govern them, it's not clear if the labor laws are the labor laws from the country where the shipping agent is that hired them, or whether it's the labor laws of the country that's flag is on the ship. So I feel really bad for these guys because they're kind of in limbo. Anyway, so they're stuck, they're not going anywhere. And then all of a sudden as China starts pulling out of their COVID lockdowns, as they start regaining some production, as Americans start seeing their incomes go up, we can't go on vacation. So what do? We buy refrigerators, right? Anybody else? I didn't buy a refrigerator. I bought a washing machine. Anybody else buy a washing machine with, like, you know, you got your relief check and you went out and bought it? Anyone? Nobody bought it. Apparently it's just me. We start buying stuff, and that has to start coming from China. So they go from having nothing going on to having just massive upticks in demand for their services. Evergreen, the company that operates, just me, Evergreen, the company that operates Ever Given, saw their monthly revenue rise from 15 million a month in January 2020 to $30 million a month in March of 21. So they basically doubled their monthly gross revenue in the course of a year. Okay, so they go from everybody's barely making money to now they would make more money if they could move faster. It jumped by 10 million a month just between November 2020 and March of 21. So just in that basically 6-month period, their revenue jumped by almost 100%. Okay, it's a very wild time to be in the maritime shipping industry right now, which is one of the reasons you're seeing all of that traffic going on right now. Having said that, it's showing up in some weird ways. There's currently a global shortage of containers. No one actually knows how many containers there are in the world. The estimates range. I've seen lower bound estimates of 5 million to upper bound estimates of about 170 million. No one really knows how many are out there. that we do know that the capacity, the global capacity for carrying containers is about 34 million containers. So we think there's at least 34 million out there, on the assumption there's got to be at least a container for every ship. But right now, because Europe and the US are buying some of the stuff from China, we're running what current account deficits with China, deficits and stuff. We're using every single container we get our hands on. A bunch of them are getting deadheaded. They're getting stuck in various places in the US. But what's happening now is about 75% of all containers are going back to China empty, just because they need to get them back so that they can rebuild them. The main production facilities for containers are mostly in China. Anecdotally, what we're hearing out of China is that the price of those new containers, they used to be about $1,400-1,500 for a new container, and now they're running about $3,500. So just the prices of the containers themselves have basically doubled in the last year, which is kind of wild. So we've got this industry that has gone from basically being flatlined for the last decade to now it's just kind of, they cannot make enough money. There's at least 50 new mega ships that have been ordered within the last year to meet demand for these services. So what's going to happen is, you know, that in about 3 years, you're going to start seeing that they're none of them are profitable again because they've got too much capacity. That's my prediction. Okay, but wait, there's more. Okay, the other thing with the global shipping industry is that it's under a lot of stress due to climate change regulation. When we look at sort of where the industry is, over the last 3 years, they've been trying to adopt policies to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions that come out of this. As you might expect with all of these ships going across the ocean, there's a lot of, you know, pollution that they put out. And this is very much a long run challenge for the industry. When you talk about the sheer volume of greenhouse gas emissions they put out, the International Maritime Organization, which is, it's an offshoot of the UN, estimates that about 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions between 2007 and 2012 came from maritime shipping. What's really concerning is when you start looking at subsets within greenhouse gas emissions, specifically sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. About 13% of all your sulfur dioxide and 15% of nitrogen oxide comes specifically from shipping. So it's a big player in terms of total emissions, but it's a really big player in some very specific types of emissions. The big problem actually has to do with the fuel type. When you look at a lot of particularly older ships, they tend to use what's called bunker fuel. Bunker fuel is, I don't know if anybody's ever hung out with ships. Bunker fuel is, it's gnarly. It's kind of like tar. It's kind of the leftover stuff when you make everything else in the refinery. It's sludge. You literally have to heat it up to make it viscous enough to get it to flow through the piping within your engine. I mean, it basically should have like twigs in it. It's horrible stuff, but it's really cheap. It's also super, super high content of sulfur. It smells like death, literally. It's horrible. It's super sticky. It's nasty. It's gross. And there's a proposal right now within the IMO to drop the sulfur content within bunker fuel from 2.5 to from 2.5% of it being sulfur to 0.5% to try to bring those sulfur compounds down. Along with that, they want to regulate the addition of scrubbers. Scrubbers are cleaning devices on the smokestacks. The low S is lower sulfur fuel. Switching from bunker fuel to diesel. Marine diesel 2. Anybody? Marine diesel 2 is low sulfur content diesel. And liquefied natural gas is another option of using that as substitute fuels. The problem is anytime you start doing that stuff, you're talking about changing the physical characteristics of the ship. You either have to go retrofit an existing ship, or it's easiest to go and put those types of technologies on newer ships. So yet again, you get this pressure to go replace old ships with new ships, which then puts that much more downward pressure on the costs. And it really is, this is all driven by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They really want to do it, and they've got some fairly aggressive targets. They want to reduce their carbon emissions by 30% by 2030 relative to 2008. Want to cut their carbon emissions by 70% by 2050 relative to 2008. Those are really aggressive targets. I mean, that is a very aggressive, and that's going to require significant action. The thing with that is it tends to favor the bigger, richer shipping lines more, because they've got the money to go and adopt newer ships with the better technology. So like Maersk, like the biggest shipping company on the planet, is completely in favor of this because they've got the pockets to do it. And they actually view this as a way that they can knock out some of their competitors. So it's a challenge, and it's mostly being phased in through new construction. So you're seeing a lot of new construction. Yet again, that pressure on get bigger and get cheaper. The International Trade Forum of the OECD has also set decarbonization as a goal by 2035. And they're pushing for complete decarbonization. They want to have a completely decarbonized shipping industry by 2030. It's really aggressive. I'm not sure that's gonna pull off. They push for it primarily through changes in technology, such things like adopting scrubbers, adopting different methods of shipping. They're experimenting actually with sails, kind of cool. Maersk has been experimenting with rotary cylinder sails on some of their vessels as a way to kind of, because then you're using God to push you along. It's kind of cool. But yet again, Maersk can do that because they're the biggest. Operations. During the Great Recession back in 2008, a large number of the shipping firms decided that the way that they could get cheaper was be slower. Most of your container ships are designed to operate around their optimal speed is about 23 knots. That's what they're designed to do, but they found that they could take them down to 8 to 10 knots, and that would just cut their fuel like nobody's business. And so, yeah, it takes longer, but if it cuts the fuel cost enough, it's worth it. So they're experimenting with slower speeds, which is kind of like a Back to the Future type thing. 23 knots, like I said, is sort of standard now. 8 to 10 knots was sort of the norm before World War II. So congratulations, we're really going back to the Roaring 20s, just in different ways. And then last but not least is alternative fuels, and that's primarily you're seeing a push toward LNG. We have seen some experiments with some of those smaller container ships, the smaller kind of regional feeders, the 2,500 TEU vessels. Seen a couple that actually are hybrids. Yeah, as an aside, how much of the US Navy is nuclear powered? So the nukes, only the carriers and the submarines are nukes. We used to have some nuclear powered surface combatants, cruisers and destroyers, but they're too expensive to operate. Is it considered clean to throw? We actually don't use bunker fuel. So the Navy doesn't use bunker fuel. We use, most of our surface combatants are actually gas turbines. So they actually use it's kind of like kerosene is the best way to describe it. It's JP8 or for those of you who are familiar with jet fuel. You can also use diesel, you can use marine diesel, low sulfur diesel, either one of those will operate. You have to do some things to switch between them, but nukes are considered cost effective for submarines and carriers because their service lives are 40, 50 years. So that's a great question, Aaron. So the big kind of challenge on the horizon is once they finish getting through this kind of boom period from COVID, there's still that existing pressure to go recognize the carbon emissions challenges, the climate change challenges that they're confronting. It'll be interesting to see how they use the profits that they make right now, whether they use that as a kind of launching pad for recapitalizing and moving in a lower carbon direction. So it's kind of interesting. But I had to throw that climate change in there because it is Earth Day. So yeah, kind of cool. And that should be getting pretty close. The big thing about this, is that it's a weird market. It's really interesting, just the way that all of this fits together. It's really essential. We don't really see a whole lot of it, but it operates in, it's super competitive. It's way bigger than people realize. And it's just kind of existing out there in the background. It's got some really unique market forces, significant downward pressure on prices, significant returns to scale. You just don't see that level of returns to scale in most industries. Side effect of that, you see the oligopoly very much at play, and that oligopoly keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger as those economies of scale effects on the size of the ships gets more and more pronounced. And it's got some unique challenges, you know, that it's very boom and bust, super boom and bust. They go back and forth between being really unprofitable to things like right now where they're being super profitable. And it's really interesting, just the way that works. But it's also really fragile. It's really fragile. We saw that all it takes is one ship having a bad day in the Suez Canal, and 13% of the world's trade goes sideways, literally. So do you guys, apparently, like, one of the side effects of that is that you can't get bubble tea. There is a global shortage of boba balls. So tapioca balls are their supply chain was disrupted because of the disruption of movement through the Suez Canal. So do not be surprised if you have a hard time getting bubble tea. I was informed of this by my daughter. I know, it's terrifying. So fun stuff. And then IKEA. IKEA estimates that about 850 of its particular expansion of shipbuilding. Okay, actually, it's really interesting. The shipbuilding facilities, it's really concentrated. A lot of it's concentrated in Asia. The bulk of your shipbuilding capacity is currently in China. The other big commercial yards are in Korea and Japan. They are not as cost competitive with China as they used to be, but they're kind of heavily subsidized by their national governments. In Europe, the bulk of your commercial ship construction typically happens in Germany, Poland, or to a lesser extent, Spain. You get some custom manufacturing, some specialized stuff in France. They make really nice stuff, actually. In the United States, we don't typically see much shipbuilding, commercial maritime shipping built in the United States, except for stuff that's meant specifically for traffic within the United States. The US has what's called the Jones Act, which restricts if you've got a ship that is going between US ports, it has to be US flagged, and they also typically have to still be US built. So you see a lot of construction that is meant specifically for the Jones Act. A lot of the Jones Act on the West Coast is between the mainland and Hawaii. You also see some other kind of specialized types of manufacturer in the United States where to comply with some of our environmental restrictions, you see some of the yards, like the NASCO yard down in San Diego will produce certain things specifically because they have to comply with US environmental laws to come in and out of certain ports. So yeah, goals in these shipping industries, particularly expansion of shipbuilding facility, I don't see it's going to be much bigger. If anything, I see it's going to get concentrated just because the companies that have the specialized skills to build the mega ships are pretty limited. So, but it's kind of cool. It's very different, and it's out there in the background. People don't realize it's out there. If you want to learn more, I debated putting up like the list of all the journal articles and things like that I was using. I decided not to do that unless all of you are having COVID-induced insomnia. But if you're looking for fun reads, there's a couple really sort of fun books out there. There's one actually called 90% of Everything by an English journalist named Rose George. It's quite a bit of fun. There's also Mark Levinson's The Box, which is a history of shipping containers. Absolutely fascinating. Really enjoy that. Great beach read. I'm dead serious. And then there's also Outlaw Ocean. Outlaw Ocean is actually, it's a series of essays that Ian Rabina did for the New York Times looking at maritime trade. So it covers kind of everything in terms of maritime trade, from fishing to container ships, to actually includes a really great chapter on repo processes. When merchant shipping companies go bankrupt, sometimes the banks try to repossess the cargo ships. Um, and so there's this whole discussion of how you repossess a cargo ship. Are the megaships contributing to floating garbage? No, most of the garbage we get out in the open ocean, when you talk about like you talk about things like the mid-Pacific gyre, the giant plastic slurry in the middle, the garbage patch. Is that what you're kind of asking about, Carolyn? Because most of that actually is plastic waste that comes from coastal areas, particularly in China and the Pacific Rim. So when you talk about that, the garbage patch and the mid-Pacific gyre, a lot of it is coming from, like I said, Asia. It gets into some of the main currents and it just winds up concentrating and consolidating. Now, having said that, you've got there is what's called MARPOL, the restrictions on dumping oil and sewage and things like that out in the ocean. And you do actually get some major problems with maritime shipping, less so from the mega ships and more from actually the smaller players, the older vessels, the ones that are less, they're just older, that they tend to be fairly significant sources of pollution. When you talk about so fun fact, the 15 most polluting cargo ships in the world actually pollute almost as much carbon monoxide as all the cars in the US. So fun fact, but those are older ships. Those are typically, they're well known. They're kind of scungy. Scungy being the technical term for they're not clean. So yeah, I know it's not so fun fact. But yeah, so there's a hope that those ships will gradually get replaced, so there'll be less of an issue with that. So anyway, okay. And that's kind of any questions, anything out there? I guess I've talked for more than I thought. So like I said, it's always sort of fun when you do one of these for the first time and you don't really know quite how long it's going to go. So and we'll finish up with Linfield Victory because we just have to. Like I said, she's not a container ship, but she's beautiful all the same.
It's a tradition.
Yes.
Yeah, if anybody doesn't have any more questions, I definitely just want to thank Dr. Eric Schuck, as always, for being such a great Pubs and Profs host. And I always learn so much, and I hope everyone else did too. And thank you again for taking the time out of your Thursday evening to sit here and learn with us. I never introduced myself, but I'm Kaylee, and I'm an alumni engagement officer here at Linfield. So I will be seeing you all at the next Pubs and Profs. And enjoy your evening. Have a great weekend.
Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks, Justine. Thanks, Nathan.